Welcome to Pikeville History Moments, where we talk about the history and heritage of Pikeville, Kentucky, and the surrounding area. Today, we're talking about Katherine Langley, the first woman from our state to be elected to serve in the United States Congress. She certainly took an unusual route to get there, and unfortunately, that seems to have overshadowed her accomplishments. Telling her story requires that we discuss some of her husband's career, but we will focus as much as possible on Miss Langley herself. Stick around to the end to hear about her encounter with aviation royalty. Emma Katherine Gudger was born in February of 1888 near Marshall, North Carolina. That's about 20 miles north of Asheville. She was the daughter of John Gudger and Catherine Hawkins Gudger. He was a United States Congressman from western North Carolina for 16 years. Growing up, the younger Catherine was exposed to politics and public service through her father's work, and she developed a keen interest in the field. She graduated from the Woman's College in Richmond, Virginia, which merged with West Hampton College in 1916, before briefly attending Emerson College of Oratory in Boston. In 1904, Katherine began working in her father's Washington office. While there, she met and married John Langley, a Pikeville resident who had been a state representative before serving in the United States Census Bureau. John was elected to the United States Congress a few years after they married, serving from 1907 until 1926. Katherine served as his secretary and became a leader amongst women in her party, and a fixture of the Washington social scene. She was the first woman to be elected to the Kentucky State Central Committee, was a founder of the Woman's Republican State Committee, and served as a delegate to the National Party Convention in 1924. It was also in 1924 that Pork Barrel John Langley's career began to unravel. John was convicted of transporting and selling liquor in violation of Prohibition laws. After 2 years, he had exhausted his appeals, resigned his seat, and was forced to enter the Atlanta Penitentiary in January 1926. Shortly after Langley's resignation, Paintsville Judge A.J. Kirk was elected to complete the unexpired term. However, Katherine Langley was determined to clear her husband's name and continue his work. The Lexington Leader said that Langley's constituents believed that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. The Langleys tapped into that sentiment. With John's active help from prison, Katherine ran a redemption campaign that was based on his claims of innocence. But the campaign was not all about him. She impressed voters with her skills on the stump, and one voter was reported to have said, "John Langley wears the breeches, but the lady has the brains." She defeated Judge Kirk in the August 1926 primary and went on to defeat Douglas Hayes in November with 58% of the vote. John was paroled just a few months later, just before Christmas, and Katherine Langley was sworn in the following March, becoming the first woman to represent Kentucky in the United States Congress. Katherine Langley's election was a milestone for women in politics. Women had only been granted the right to vote a few years earlier, and it was still uncommon for them to hold public office. Katherine's decades of experience in Washington, her college education, and her party roles had prepared her for legislative success. However, there were still challenges during her time in Congress. Initially, John's conviction resulted in Washington society shunning the newly elected representative despite her years there. She won them over quickly, though, when she interrupted a debate on a tax bill just to celebrate the on-court successes of tiny Carr Creek High School's basketball team. It couldn't have helped that women in politics were treated as a media curiosity at the time, and Katherine was singled out for supposed flamboyance. One reporter wrote, "She offends the squeamish by her unstinted display of gypsy colors on the floor and the conspicuousness with which she dresses her bushy blue-black hair." Still, Katherine Langley worked tirelessly on behalf of her constituents and fought for issues such as better roads, health care, agricultural policy, veterans issues, and education. She was an active member of several committees, including the Committees on Claims, Immigration and Naturalization, and Education. She was ahead of her time in some ways, even giving a speech in 1928 announcing her support for an Equal Rights Amendment. Katherine Langley's daughter, Catherine Bentley, worked as her mother's secretary during her time in Congress, and the two women formed a close bond as they worked together to serve the people of Kentucky. Their relationship reflected Katherine Langley's commitment to family and community and added to her popularity. John Langley couldn't help himself, and he caused another mild scandal. For nearly all her first term, Miss Langley lobbied President Calvin Coolidge, who had been a friend of the Langleys, to pardon John. Coolidge finally granted the pardon in late 1928, with a rumored condition being that John would stay out of politics. But just a few weeks later, Mr. Langley circulated a Christmas letter to the district's voters and almost at once followed that up by announcing that he intended to run for the seat his wife now occupied. John had apparently not gotten Katherine's approval to replace her, and she told the papers she wouldn't step aside for John or anyone else. That apparently settled the matter. John Langley stayed in Pikeville and continued his law practice. But the episode may have harmed their prospects. In 1930, Katherine Langley fought off two primary challenges before losing in the fall. She was among 52 Republican House members to lose their seats, with her loss being called the most dramatic upset of the campaign by the Washington Evening Star. In retrospect, it's hard to understand the surprise given the economic environment. The Great Depression was underway, the coal business was suffering, and Democrats across the country won seats they had rarely, if ever, held. John Langley passed away from pneumonia in 1932. Katherine was devastated by the loss, but she continued to work in politics and public service, announcing a failed campaign for Congress in April of that year. In 1934, she made a bid for the United States Senate, but lost in the primary election. She continued to be active in party and charity roles, and then in 1939, she became the first woman elected to the Kentucky Railroad Commission. For that term ending in 1943, she was the only woman to serve statewide elective office in Kentucky. While on the commission, she worked to improve railroad safety and for better working conditions for railroad employees. Langley also served as Pikeville's postmaster for a time, was a member of the Eastern Stars, the Women's Club, the Business and Professional Women's Club, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Baptist Church. She was Pike County's Red Cross representative during World War I and was active in the National Cancer Fund's campaign and served as that organization's chair in eastern Kentucky for several years. Catherine Gudger Langley passed away in August 1948 at the age of 60. Her legacy lives on as a trailblazing woman in politics. Her election to Congress paved the way for future women to enter public service, and her advocacy for women and children, work on the Railroad Commission, and commitment to public service showed her dedication to improving the lives of her fellow Kentuckians. She was only the 7th woman to serve in the United States House of Representatives, and it wasn't until 1996, 66 years after Langley's defeat, that another woman from Kentucky, Ann Northup, was elected to represent Kentucky in Congress. To this day, there are only 2 women to represent Kentucky in Washington, and there are nearly 100 districts across the country that have never been represented by a woman. Katherine Langley's legacy should remind us of the importance of women being involved in public service, and should serve as an inspiration for future generations of women leaders, especially for young women from Pikeville and Pike County. And now, let's delve into the fascinating episode in Katherine Langley's life when she took to the skies with none other than Charles Lindbergh. Langley was one of 6 members of Congress who received a plane ride from Lindbergh himself in 1928, just a year after his historic transatlantic flight. At that time, Lindbergh was probably the most famous person in the world. Interestingly, Lindbergh was friends with John Paul Riddle, the subject of an earlier video of ours, who grew up in Pikeville and went on to become a pioneer in aviation education and co-founder of the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Florida. In 1928, Riddle was barnstorming and operating an aviation mail delivery business out of Cincinnati. The aviation world was small then, and Riddle and Lindbergh had spent a considerable amount of time together. It would be fascinating to know if Langley and Lindbergh realized they had had that connection and discussed Riddle during their flight. It's worth noting that Bessie Riddle Arnold, John Paul's younger sister, became the first woman in Pike County to be elected to a county office just a few years after Langley's loss in Congress. Pike County has a proud history of supporting women in politics, and we invite you to watch our video on Bessie Arnold to learn more. Thank you for watching Pikeville History Moments. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe, or click on the link to our website at visitpikeville.com. If you have an interest in seeing the gravesite of Katherine Langley, it is located above the Johnson Cemetery. It's a bit of a hike, so please be careful. If you have any questions about Miss Langley, please comment on the video or email us at tourism@pikevilleky.gov.